I had always been the studious type, loving nature and everything green from a young age. This passion drove me to become an environmental engineer, a job I didn't just do, but lived for. My life was pretty routine until I met Mark at a friend's party. He was charming, a bit shy, and had the warmest smile I'd seen in a long time. We clicked instantly, and before I knew it, we were dating. A couple of months down the line, Mark thought it was time I met his family. I was nervous, but excited too. Little did I know, this was going to be one interesting evening. We drove up to a cozy little house surrounded by a well-kept garden. Mark rang the doorbell, and a woman with a kind face and soft eyes opened the door. This was Laura, Mark's mom. She welcomed us with a hug that felt like it could warm the coldest of days. Come in, come in. I've heard so much about you, Heather. Laura enthused, pulling me into the warmth of the home. As we stepped into the living room, there she was, Julia, lounging on the couch with a look that could freeze hell over. Next to her sat an older man, Ted, who gave me a nod and a faint smile. Julia didn't move, just sized me up with a cold stare. Dinner's almost ready, Laura announced, breaking the tension a little. Why don't you all sit down and chat? I sat next to Mark, who seemed oblivious to the frosty air his sister was giving off. Julia finally spoke, her voice sharp, cutting through the small talk like a knife. So, you're the latest flame, huh? An environmental, what now? Julia's tone was dismissive, her words dripped with a disdain that was hard to miss. Environmental engineer, I corrected gently, trying to keep my voice even. I work with industrial companies to ensure they meet environmental standards. Ted chuckled a little, trying to lighten the mood. Let the girl be, Julia. We need more people looking after the planet. Julia rolled her eyes but shifted her gaze back to her phone, disinterested. Dinner was served, and Laura made sure the conversation steered clear of any icebergs. We talked about the weather, the garden, and Laura's recipes, anything safe and sound. After dinner, Mark and I helped clear the table while Julia disappeared into another room, with Richard following shortly after. Laura leaned in close while we were washing the dishes. Don't mind Julia, she whispered, as if reading my mind. She's always been a bit tough around the edges. You made a great impression, believe me. Thanks, Laura, I appreciate it, I murmured, more reassured but still feeling the sting of Julia's words. On the drive home, Mark was all apologies. I'm really sorry about Julia. She's Julia. Don't take it to heart. I nodded, though part of me wondered just how much of Julia's hostility I'd have to endure. But looking over at Mark, with his earnest blue eyes full of apology, I decided some battles were worth fighting. It had been a whirlwind year with Mark. Despite the bumps, mostly caused by his sister Julia, our relationship had deepened into something I couldn't imagine being without. But just as we started planning our future together, tragedy struck. Julia's husband, Ted, passed away unexpectedly. The funeral was a grand, gloomy affair. Julia, veiled and somber, played the part of the grieving widow to a T. Something about her tears felt off to me, like she was putting on a show. But I bit my tongue, chalking it up to my already strained feelings towards her. A couple of months later, Mark and I decided it was time to move forward with our own lives. We were planning a simple wedding, nothing extravagant, just an intimate celebration of our love. That's when the drama unfolded. I really think you should wait, Julia burst out during what I had hoped would be a peaceful family dinner at her place. Her eyes were fierce, her voice a sharp edge, cutting through the calm. You can't seriously think of celebrating when I'm still in mourning. It's disrespectful, it's indecent. Mark looked taken aback, his fork halfway to his mouth. Julia, it's been 2 months, and we're only talking about a small. 2 months, she snapped, slamming her palm on the table, making the silverware jitter. My husband is dead. Do you think that feels like 2 months to me? No wedding until a year has passed. That's final. Mark, ever the peacemaker, touched my arm, a silent plea. Heather, maybe we should consider it. It's just a few more months. The atmosphere remained charged, each meeting with Julia a tiptoe around a minefield. Mark remained oblivious to the undercurrents, or perhaps he chose to be, thinking it was the only way to keep peace in the family. A year had slowly passed since the funeral, and Mark and I finally got married. The ceremony was simple, just close friends and family in a little chapel downtown. Mark's mom, Laura, was radiant, brimming with joy for us, but Julia was another story. She was there, physically, but her smiles were forced, her eyes distant. I figured it was the memories of her late husband that made her so withdrawn. After the wedding, Mark and I settled into a modest rented apartment. It was cozy, filled with the laughter and plans of newlyweds, until reality knocked on our door with the news of Laura's illness. It was sudden and severe. She was bedridden, her limbs weak, and she suffered from excruciating headaches and kidney pain. Without much discussion, Mark suggested, "We should move in with Mom. She needs us." So, we packed up our lives and moved into his childhood home to take care of Laura. It was there that I truly stepped into the role of a caregiver. I bathed her, combed her hair, which was thinning alarmingly, and did my best to keep her comfortable. One day, while trying to untangle her hair, I suggested, "Mark, maybe we should consider a specialized care facility. They could handle her medical needs better." Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Heather. Julia is really set on keeping Mom here. Let's try to manage a bit longer." Julia's visits were frequent and usually ended in criticism. One afternoon, she stormed in just as I had finished cleaning the kitchen. "You call this clean? And what's that smell? Can't you cook something decent?" "I'm doing the best I can, Julia. It's not like I have any help," I shot back, frustration bleeding into my voice. Julia snorted, "Excuses. You're just lazy. And poor Mom, stuck with your pathetic cooking and cleaning." Before I could respond, Mark walked in, his face drawn. "Heather, just let it go. It's not worth the argument." His words stung, always quick to defend his sister, never me. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere at home grew heavy with unspoken tensions. I found myself dreading Julia's visits, the air thickening the moment she stepped through the door. Her accusations were relentless. "You're neglecting her. Look at her, she's wasting away and you just watch," Julia would hurl at me during her brief, tempestuous visits. And every time, Mark would side with her. "Heather, maybe try a little harder with Mom. Julia might have a point," he'd say, which only poured salt on my open wounds. I felt isolated, caught in a home where my efforts were unseen and unappreciated. Conversations with Mark about it led nowhere, circles of blame that always ended with "my sister is right." 2 months had never passed so slowly. Laura's health continued to decline, despite my best efforts, and then, one grim morning, she passed away. The house plunged into a deeper silence than the morning we had already been living under. Mark was devastated, his mother had been his anchor, and now that she was gone, he seemed adrift, lost in his grief. The funeral was a blur of black attire and whispered condolences. I stood beside Mark, offering what comfort I could, but the real storm brewed when Julia approached us by the graveside, her face twisted not just with grief, but anger. "You should have done more," she hissed quietly, ensuring only I could hear. "If you cared half as much about her as you do about your damn plants, she'd still be here." I felt a sting at her words, anger mingling with my sorrow. "Julia, Laura needed professional care, not just us." "I told you." "Excuses," she snapped back, her voice sharp as a knife. "You just didn't want to deal with the burden." I glanced at Mark, hoping for support, but his eyes were fixed on the freshly turned earth. Later, at home, I tried to speak to him. "Mark, you heard what your sister said. You know it's not true. You need to talk to her, make her understand." Mark rubbed his temples, the weight of his world etched deeply across his brow. "Heather, Julia's all I have left now. She's hurting. Don't stir things up. I can't handle more drama." The following day, as I was cleaning out Laura's desk, a sheaf of medical documents caught my eye. Curiosity piqued, I began reading. The records showed that just a year ago, Laura was in remarkable health for her age. Yet, within a year, her body had succumbed to multiple organ failures. It was unsettling. That evening, I brought it up with Mark. "Did you know your mom was completely healthy a year ago? And now, suddenly, all her organs just failed?" Mark didn't look up from his paper. "Yeah, so? It happens, Heather. People get sick. But doesn't it seem weird to you? Your sister's husband, didn't he die of something similar?" I pressed, hoping he'd see the connection. Mark sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Ted had his own issues, Heather. He was older, and these things are common enough at his age. But both of them complained about losing hair before they got seriously ill. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" I couldn't keep the frustration from my voice. Mark slammed his paper down, glaring at me. "You're starting to sound paranoid, Heather. Just stop, all right? This isn't some mystery novel. This is real life, and in real life, people get sick and die without it being a plot." I recoiled, stung by his harsh words. "I'm just worried, Mark. There's a pattern here that we can't ignore." "Enough, Heather," his voice boomed, echoing off the walls. "My sister's right. You're just trying to find blame because you feel guilty. Just stop with these crazy theories." I stood there, words failing me as I watched him storm out of the room. His dismissal of my concerns hurt, but it also set a resolve within me. Something was wrong, and I couldn't let it go, no matter how much it upset Mark. It started with a simple, terrifying moment. I woke up early one morning feeling something wasn't quite right. Running my hands through my hair as I often did while planning my day, I froze. Clumps of hair came away in my hands, not just strands, but whole locks. Panic surged through me as I stared at them, the reality setting in with cold clarity. Scared and unsure, I arranged for a blood test at the company lab first thing. As an environmental engineer, I knew a bit about what symptoms to flag, but nothing prepared me for the results. Traces of thallium, a heavy metal poison, were found in my bloodstream. My mind raced with the implications. Someone had poisoned me, but who? Barely holding back my fear, I approached Mark with the results later that day. "Mark, look at this," I said, handing him the lab report. "There's thallium in my blood. This isn't an accident. Someone's doing this." Mark's face transformed from concern to disbelief, and then to something darker. "Thallium? Heather, this is insane. Are you suggesting someone in the family?" "Yes, I think someone is trying to poison me," I interrupted, desperate for him to understand. "And I'm not the first. Remember your mom? Remember Ted?" He shook his head, stepping back as if my words physically pushed him. "You're losing it, Heather. You're seeing conspiracies where there are none. It's like you're obsessed." As we argued, voices raised and fraught with tension, Julia walked in. The timing couldn't have been worse. She caught the tail end of our conversation, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together the scene. "Heather, aren't you working in a lab? With access to all sorts of chemicals?" Julia's voice was cold, calculated. "Maybe you brought home some of your work. Maybe you're the one poisoning people." I stared at her, aghast. "What? No. I'm being poisoned, Julia. Why would I do that to myself?" Mark turned to look at me, his expression hardening. "I can't do this anymore, Heather. I can't trust you. You're talking about poisoning, and all I see is paranoia. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a blow. "Mark, you can't mean that. We need to figure this out together." But he was already walking away, his decision made. Julia's smirk was like a victory lap. "You heard him, Heather. Pack your stuff and get out. We don't need more of your drama here." Broken, I returned to our room, my hands trembling as I packed. Each folded shirt, each photo placed back into boxes, felt like erasing a part of my life. With every item, I felt more isolated, more abandoned. By evening, my car was loaded with the last of my things. I looked back at the house, a place that had been my home, filled with dreams and then nightmares. The weight of what I was leaving behind, and the fear of the unknown ahead, pressed down on me. I settled into a small apartment near my workplace. As I unpacked my few belongings, the need for answers burned fiercer than ever. I spread out all the information I had, lab results, medical records, conversations, all pointing to one chilling conclusion. Julia had poisoned her husband, then her mother, and attempted the same with me. Determined to see this through, I contacted a private investigator, someone with a solid reputation for digging deep without causing a stir. I met him at a dimly lit coffee shop downtown, where I handed over all the evidence I'd gathered. I need to know everything about her recent activities, financial status, everything, I told him, my voice low but firm. The PI, a grizzled man with keen eyes, nodded slowly. I'll get on it. This looks serious, and if your suspicions are correct, you're dealing with a dangerous individual. 2 tense weeks passed before I heard back from him. We met again in the same coffee shop, where he laid out his findings before me. Your sister-in-law is in deep water, he began, his tone grave. She's burned through all the cash from her late husband's estate, and now she's drowning in debt. I leaned forward, my hands clenched tightly around my coffee cup. Is there any chance she's targeting her brother next? For financial gain? He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It's possible. People like her, they don't stop until they get what they want. She's a classic psychopath, no remorse, just objectives. The PI then slid a folder across the table to me. I'd advise you to take this to the police. She's dangerous, and this is bigger than just a family dispute. I nodded, absorbing his advice. But something within me resisted the idea of stepping back. Thank you, I'll consider it. But first, I need to try to handle this in my own way. I need to expose her, make her face her actions. Fueled by the need to protect not just myself, but also Mark, despite his current feelings toward me, I made a decision. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark's number, my heart pounding as it rang. Mark, it's Heather. We need to talk. It's important, I said as soon as he answered, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, a hesitation, then a heavy sigh. All right, Heather. Come over tomorrow morning. We'll talk then. Hanging up, I felt a mix of relief and impending dread. This was my chance, maybe my last, to set things right, or at least to try. The next day, I drove back to the house, the familiar route now laden with a mix of nostalgia and bitter anticipation. I parked outside, taking a moment in the quiet of my car to gather my thoughts. With one last look in the rearview mirror, I stepped out of the car and walked towards the house, each step heavy with the weight of the impending confrontation. Stepping into Mark's house felt surreal, like walking onto the set of a tragic play where I once knew my lines but had since forgotten them. The air was thick with tension and the summer heat, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Mark gestured towards the kitchen table where a pitcher of lemonade sat, condensation beating along its glassy exterior. It's hot out there, huh? Here, have some lemonade before we get into it, Mark said, pouring a glass and sliding it across to me. Thanks, I murmured, taking the glass. The icy drink was refreshing, momentarily pushing the impending confrontation to the back of my mind. I took a few sips, relishing the coolness. But within minutes, a sharp pain twisted in my stomach, gripping and unrelenting. I gasped, setting the glass down with a clatter. Mark, something's not right. My stomach, it hurts so much. Mark, confused and concerned, came over to my side. What's wrong? Where did this lemonade come from? I managed to ask, clutching my abdomen as the room began to spin. Julia made it before she went out, Mark replied, his brow furrowing. Heather, what's happening? I tried to steady my voice, the room tilting dangerously. Mark, the lemonade, it's poisoned. Your sister, she's trying to kill us. For the inheritance. We need to call 911, now. I collapsed onto the floor, the cold tiles a harsh contrast to the heat that flushed my face. At that moment, the front door swung open and Julia walked in, her timing as impeccable